Okay, this is going to be my strategy here. First, I'll start with an introduction about the debate around the phenomenon of color. I'm going to explain why there is a debate at all. Then I'm going to introduce the main contemporary positions in this debate, like the space of options. After that, I'm going to put my attention in the main problems of these positions share. Once that is done, I will present another position, the relationalism about color, and I'm going to hold that even though this compatibilist option is better than the previous ones, there are still some big issues to be solved. I will end my presentation with new perspectives on the subject. So, as usual in philosophy, to present a problem is by itself a problem. There are different strategies. Let me start with a very widespread explanation of what science tells us about visual function. This is going to be more general than just color. It's visual function. This is taken from a paper of Chilean neuroscientist Pedro Maldonado, who presented last week as part of this cycle. So he said, when we review a neuroscience textbook on visual function, we will find that typically the visual world is depicted as an image projected on the retina that in turn is transmitted by the visual pathway and subsequently projected on the primary visual cortex, where the image is reconstructed. This image is then interpreted by some other area of the brain. In this view, the neuronal activity of the retina is transmitted progressively from the eye to the lateral geniculate nucleus, the visual thalamus, and then conveyed towards the primary visual cortex. From there, the visual activity is transmitted successively toward other higher cortices, where eventually it produces the final representation that the object are being observed. So in other words, the traditional paradigm is based in a representational model, where perception is a feed-forward, unidirectional process in which the visual cortex is but just one stage of a hierarchical system. Therefore, perception would occur because of the activation at the highest level of this hierarchy. So that was a lot of words, so let me just put an image on it. There's a regular, in this picture, the representational model, we have the outside world. This is going to be very important later on my talk. There's an outside world. There are some relevant aspects of this outside world, the external world. And then you have a process that goes from the retina to higher level processing in the brain. And then you will, those are neurons, by the way, and then you have a final representation of the dog. So you have a conscious representation that it's the last step on a hierarchical system, right? There are a lot of things to say about this, but just let me continue. Because the same Maldonado, this is going to be a little bit funny. He's an anti-representationalist. He's presenting this framework in order to criticize it after that. But even Maldonado, who is an anti-representationalist, about color, he's different. He's thinking different. When he was asked about color, he said like the all-known history of color from this point of view. The story goes briefly like this. Radiant energy flows through the environment with many different wavelengths. This is what we all know. Some of these wavelengths interact with our bodies, while some of them pass right through, like radio or television signals. They don't interact with us, right? Of the band of the electromagnetic radiation that interact with us, a very narrow portion is called the visible light. The process is somehow well known. The light impacts the retina of the eye, where we find 3 different photoreceptors called cones. Each of them respond to different wavelengths of the visible light. This theory is called the trichromatic theory. And together with the opposite process theory, it's the explanation of how this whole process happened in the brain. Somehow the trichromatic theory explains better the first moments of our color vision, and the opposite process theory more or less what happens later in our brain, specifically in our visual cortex. Now, the important aspect of the physical stimuli in the picture in this picture are the wavelengths of light, meaning the part of the process that is outside or in the world, right? The point is that those wavelengths are not themselves color. Another way to put it is by saying that outside our body, there are not colors to be found. This is like the classical story from this point of view. This picture is so widespread that even, as I said, anti-representationalists like Pedro Maldonado, when asked about color, will say that that phenomenon of color is something happening in your head alone. And this is so well known nowadays, he would say, that this is something trivial. This is the actual word that he used. Color is trivial by now. It's something that we all know how it happens. It's not problematic in science at all. Of course, it's fair to say that not all scientists think that way, but just for you to see how a person that is supposedly not in this picture, when it comes to color, is absolutely with this picture. Okay? So this is just what we all what I explained. I mean, you have different wavelengths, right? So there's just a little portion that's called the visible light, and that supposedly impacts your eyes. And there's a process in your eyes. Then there is a process in your brain, hierarchically, like some neurons, some specific neurons, or some specific group of neurons, or some specific modules, apparently, are specifically made to detect what is entering to your eyes, and then you have a representation of red. Okay, so it's not that difficult to see, right? The wavelengths, they end up here. From here is always something inside. Okay, but outside, these wavelengths, they are not colored themselves. This is the whole point. So the triviality of color, they would say, comes from the fact that we know that outside our heads there is no color, since at least the work on light by Sir Isaac Newton. In other words, we have known that there are no colors out there for literally centuries. Now, there are a lot of problems with this widespread picture. First of all, it is not clear that the modern treatment of color initiated by Newton can lead us straight forward to this eliminativism about color. As a matter of fact, we could say that we have two different Newtons in the treatment of color, even from the beginning. Don't worry, I'm not introducing any evil twin or anything. The point is, as Ivan Thompson argues, that what Newton actually left us is an ambiguity of the treatment of color. For on one hand, Newton makes claims about our experience of color as causally explained in terms of objective, primary qualities. In contemporary terms, light from the long wave end of spectrum causes sensation of red, for instance. While on the other hand, since things can look a certain way only in relation to a perceiver, there is an ineliminable subjective element in the analysis of color. This is what Ivan Thompson called the received view. So the only important thing is one Newton, so to speak, put the accent on the light aspect. So color is somehow like a disposition of light, something that is out there. But at the same time, in other moments of his book, he puts the accent on the perceiver. There is no color phenomena without a perceiver. It's more, he talks about disposition more in this sense. So why is this important? Because this ambiguity is what makes the debate in philosophical terms now. Okay. So if you are close to this second Newton, the one that puts the accent in the perceiver, you will end up with probably with a dispositionalist theory of color. But if you are closer to the first Newton, you are going to be an eliminativist, probably. So yeah, just I'm not having time to say a lot of things about these theories. Obviously, there are a lot of arguments in favor of each of these theories. This is just another thing is I took this from Jonathan Cohen's book, The Red and the Real. He actually proposed a different space of option as this one, but this is the classical one. Okay, so this is what you will mostly find in books. So the thing is, let me just highlight some of the big problems involved in general with this. The eliminativist option, that the one I started with, the scientific one, the Maldonado's vision, somewhat lead us to the idea that experience of color is like a systematic illusion, if not a collective hallucination. Because somehow, if we are perceiving something that is not actually there, it's like we are projecting it. We are projecting in the world something that is not actually there. You only have colorless wavelengths, and we are perceiving colors, something different than that. So what are colors? Well, an option seems to be like there are nothing outside in the world, it's just something in your head, therefore you're just projecting. So a collective hallucination, how come this is we are like in a collective hallucination? It's quite obvious that the experience of color let us navigate correctly into the world. And not only us, but also non-human animals as well. Think about the search for food, for instance. How important is the way we look the world with colors, not only for us, but for animals, or to choose a potential sexual partner. It's important in almost all the important aspects of life, not only for us. So to think about color like a collective hallucination doesn't really make sense. I mean, color informs us about the world and inform us in a way that we correctly can deal with life, okay? So maybe an option, this is a very widespread option, is that a correct understanding of color vision is considering a detecting model. What we do is we detect these wavelengths, and the representation is just an expression of that detection. Okay, so with our trichromat and opponent process system, what we do is to detect different grades of the wavelengths of the visual spectrum when they reflected into surfaces. The resultant representation of it are the colors that we see in the subjective experience. But with this model in mind, it's very doubtful that we can explain some important phenomena involved in the way we perceive and use color, such as metamerism and especially color constancy. Yeah. Color constancy is defined as perceiving color as consistent even if changing illumination alters the wavelengths reflected by the objects. This is, color seems to remain the same under very different kind of illumination. This is, you will not see much difference between white paper under incandescent lamp, like this one, and the same piece of paper under daylight, even though it reflects very different wavelengths in each case. Further, experiments have shown that nearly the full range of colors can be perceived even when one or two types of cones are not stimulated. So if you think about our color vision as detection, there's a problem because the same color, and in a good way, we would say, the same color can have very different physical different wavelengths. It's absolutely not the same wavelengths that are reflected in this context with this kind of light than the ones that are reflected outside in the sun. And you are still saying that the paper is white in both contexts. Of course, it's not the same, exactly the same color, but you say, yeah, it's white. But if you go to search like what is happening in a microscopic level, very, very, very different light is reflected. So how come that? By the way, there is no red pixels in this picture. If you are seeing anything red, that show up how important this is. This is a trick. This is not in favor of eliminativism, saying this is an illusion, everything is an illusion, it's an hallucination. I'm just showing you that you can even do tricks with this. Constancy of color. Okay, so we can discuss why this happened. It's not going to be my point. I just wanted to shock you, to blow your mind. You're welcome. Sorry about that. So, but the thing is, more problems in general about this, all these theories. This is probably very familiar to Tirimuta. So, furthermore, the detecting model does not address late scientific evidence that show up the contribution of color vision to all these important visual tasks, like segmentation of objects, perception of form or shape, grouping of objects, perception of contours, perception of texture, of object detection, object identification, memorization of objects, perception of depth, perception of motion of complex objects, recognition of shadows. The point here is we do not detect colors. We see objects. And more than that, we see objects only in a context. By the way, you can see this when you are looking at what is happening in our brain, in the neurons. There is no specific neurons, a group of neurons that its only task is to detect colors. The same neurons, they work to do all this. They are very flexible. They are multitask, if you like. So somehow the representation model is not enough to explain what is happening. So again, the detection model, we have something in our heads that detects the wavelengths, and then we have a representation, fails to explain these kind of cases. Now, in general terms, none of these theories address this fact, the fact that colors are, we use colors correctly to see objects. Partially because they are committed to a representational model in which external physical stimuli are relevant feature to the hierarchical process in which supposedly particular neurons, a group of them or some module, is specifically linked to the task of detecting colors. The result is an internal representation of the outside. Even the so-called relational theorists, this is going to be one of my points here, the ones that claim that colors are constituted in terms of a relation between objects and subjects, such as Cohen or even Thompson, are somehow linked with this external objective world, internal subjective representation or separation, something that is outside in the world, something that is inside in our head. And when you do so, and this is the point, if you want to say that colors are something real, it seems like you always end up by saying, okay, they are real, therefore they are out there, even if you are a relationalist. Even when they start by saying something like, no, it's not inside, it's no outside, it's a relation, it's a system, it's dynamic. Even when they do that, somehow they end up by saying, okay, but at the end of the day, colors are something to be found outside in the world, right? So I think a relational theory of color is the right way to correctly explain colors in their whole dimension, considering not only the physical and physiological aspect of it, but also the psychological moment. However, it requires to break completely with this inside-outside framework. The thing is, that's a very radical idea. And I believe that some philosophers and some scientists, they are a little bit afraid to do this, to drop the inside-outside framework. Because it seems like if you do so, if you say something like, there is no external world, it seems like the only alternative is idealism, a la Berkeley. It's by saying, okay, so if there is no external world, there is only mental world, something like that. Or we construct the universe in that sense, because there is no external world, right? And for many, many people, philosophers, but also scientists, this is somehow too mystic, too idealistic. I don't know. It gets you too far from regular science, which framework is always this Cartesian subject and object out there. Okay. So if you want to, for some, like an activist, the act of touching something, it can be seen as a system in a way, right? Because there is an exchange of kinetic energy. It's not that difficult to say, okay, when we are touching something, there is obviously a relation between the subject that is touching and the object touched. So you can somehow explain those in terms of not an internal or external relation. You can say, no, it's a system. Don't think about the external world and the internal perception of the person. There's an energy flowing through them. Okay? So this is a dynamic system. But of course, this is not the case of color. Sight is not like touching. When you are seeing a mountain, for instance, the question is to what extent you are affecting the mountain. So the relational theory apparently requires this systematic or dynamic way of thinking when you are experiencing something. But in the case of seeing, this is very difficult to address because you're not affecting the mountain when you're seeing it. How could you say that you're in relation with that, or with the colors of the mountain or with the color itself? We said that colors helps you to see objects when the mountain is so far away. We do know how your experience of color helps you to identify and even to measure the distance of the mountain in the bluish air that is between you and the mountain. This is actually an experiment. But it sounds crazy to say that you and the mountain are part of the same process. That is a process that is neither internal or external. I'm just addressing how difficult it is to be a real relationalist that wants to drop the inside-outside framework. It's so difficult because it goes against our common sense. We are not in a system with the objects that we are seeing far away. So, from my point of view, scientists, as much as philosophers, are afraid to throw away the internal-external framework because it seems that the alternative is idealism or even solipsism. This is the idea that we create the world completely since there is no reference to the external world. Now, I think there is an alternative to this, but it's a radical one. As I said, I think relationalism and to drop the internal-external framework is a radical idea, so it needs radical commitments. So follow me in this way of thinking. If there is no internal-external, you only have one dimension, right? Let's call this dimension universe. Don't think about the concept of universe of the physicalists, because that's the external universe. That's the only thing that exists, and that's why it's so problematic to put the mind in this physical universe. No. I'm just talking, there is no outside, no inside, just one dimension. Let's call this dimension universe. If you go one step forward to that, you have to say that to experience something, you experiencing something is literally the universe experiencing itself. There's no other option. That is what is happening when you are perceiving something. It's literally the universe experiencing itself. So you could understand what is happening in terms of a reference. You are a reference to the whole universe. You're not something different. There's not something different happening inside your head. You are the universe experiencing in a particular way, and in that case, you become a reference. Okay? Think about, for instance, the notion of space in physics, nowadays physics, after Einstein. So there is no objective space. Space is not like a big bucket or box in which you can find objects inside, different objects inside. There is no objective space here. But that doesn't mean that Einstein is an idealist. He's saying, okay, space is something that you create with your mind. He's saying, no, there's no objective space, but you have some references. That's one of the consequences of relativism. So you can measure distances and even velocities, taking some references in there. So in the same way, I'm saying that when you're thinking about just one dimension that is neither internal or external, and that you are perceiving, you are the universe perceiving yourself, is in the same sense. Is that there is no objective reference in this, just particular references, and every single one of us is that reference. In that sense, you can say that we're in a process with the universe. The thing is, it's the same process of the universe. It's not a different. It's not a process between a subject here and the universe or the world in external terms. It's just the same process. Now, of course, this sounds crazy and insane, but I'm not the only one. So I'm going to finish by... how much time? Okay, just one thing before. No, I don't have time for this. It was not that important. So let me just read this. It's from Francisco Varela. So he's thinking about a middle path between representationalism and idealism. Okay, just in the terms I told you. So he say the middle path may be even more difficult to absorb, since it involves abandoning the chronic habit of trusting the world as a physical reference point that must be represented or taken as the initiating agent, and therefore also as a reference point. If we are right, our human life, our present experience, is one of the many possible creeds of knowledge, where the immense background of our biological structure and social practices is inseparable from the regularity that we discern both in the world and in the being. When we take this logic to its final consequences, we can understand the world in which we find ourselves as something that is neither separate or distant. Although we can also understand it as a world in which there are no fixed reference points. Then a footnote says, in Western tradition, this epistemology has its expression in thinkers like Merleau-Ponty or Heidegger, but it expresses in an incomparably richer context in the Madhyamika tradition of medieval India. So, now say that a lot of scientists and philosophers, like something like this looks way too mystic or way too continental. He's quoting, or his references are Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, but even India. But I believe they are just expressions of this way of thinking, as let's drop the inside-outside framework. It's not this is not an easy task. Okay, we are so engaged with this. I believe, though, that this is a constructed idea, the inside-out. It's not something that it comes from the common sense. I think it's a Cartesian, maybe Aristotle. We can go to Aristotle. The fact is, if you go to some Asia cultures, they don't have this framework. Okay, they absolutely don't have. To what extent that is useful for our discoveries in perception, just like color or other kind of perception, I believe it's very important, to change the framework. But of course, it's arguable. So yeah, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We hope have some time for questions. Nicolas?
Have one, yeah. I don't know if it is strictly. I mean, I don't know if it has, if it directly has to do with the position that you're attending, but rather with the previous part of the presentation.
Yes.
So I don't know how useful it would be, but basically, if I understood correctly, I have a couple of things, but I think the most important one is that you said that relationalism in color, but I guess you're thinking about relationalism in general, implies dropping the limit between the inner and the subject and the world, in a sense. And I don't think that's true, because I think that in order to have a relation, you have to have the relata. So basically, relationalism presupposes that you have the subject and something that he or she is being related to. And in differentiating those two things, you are presupposing that there is a limit that you can use to differentiate them. What maybe happens is that I'm not very versed in phenomenology, but if the idea that Varela is referring to is something like Umwelt or the lived world, what you have is there then in a different level of analysis. You have the phenomenological world, which comes as a product of the relationship between those two things. And maybe on that plane you cannot distinguish them, but if you're going to go into the scientific part of it, you need to be distinguishing between what's coming to the subject and the subject who is perceiving. So I don't know if that is troublesome or not. Maybe it's relevant for the position.
It is. It's very relevant. Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. So the first thing is, what I said is that till now, most relational theories, they don't drop the internal-external framework. They don't do that. Okay, so even though it seems like they are going to do it, most of them, like the intention is, in my opinion, is they want to do it. Like people like Ivan Thompson, obviously, the ecological view of color. He wants to do it. But as I said, somehow at some point, they don't take the next step. They because it separates you too much from the scientific, the orthodox scientific picture. So what I'm saying is, even though they want to do it, they are in that framework. What I'm saying after that is that a correct relational theory, or a true relational theory, true to itself, needs to drop that framework. I'm not the only one saying this, by the way. So after that, what people like Varela is saying is, when you change that framework, you stop thinking about subjects and objects. You need to start thinking about the perceiver and the environment. It's a different relation. Okay, so there's an interaction between the perceiver and the environment. Perceptual systems do not deliver a single true description of the world. Each description, in this case, is partial, because you don't have an objective reference. So there are some problems with this, obviously, because you can say, when you are perceiving something in the representational model, you are representing either in a good way or in a bad way. Right?
Yeah.
So how do you explain in these new terms? So I'm following someone that is here, but I don't want to mention her. So the evaluation of correct perception, for instance, in this case, is the behavior. That's the way you can discriminate between correct or incorrect perception about the behavior. So you have to change, in this new framework, you have to change almost every single concept that you took from the old framework, or the regular, or the orthodox framework. So this is the point. What you're saying is correct only if you are in the old framework. You don't, supposedly, you don't need to have that relata of a subject and an object in this new framework. You have only You can say it in many, many terms. Probably even a phenomenologist would say it's a situated, I don't know, being, whatever. I don't know the terms. Yeah. We can talk after. It's a very big topic. It's a very obvious.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's lots of things to say about this project. But yeah, I wondered how much you're wanting to radically move away from the assumptions that are there in the naturalistic approach to colour means that you're giving up on having any fine-grained ontology of colour, or do you actually have a proposal of how we should think of delineate, specify colour properties in a new framework? And I also wanted to ask, is this going to be a kind of naive realism in the end? Because the title essentially manifests colour properties made me think that it would be a naive realism. Because certainly, I think that McDowell's approach to colour is self-consciously sort of denying the subject object, and that's why you can talk about colours being essentially manifest. And his version of naive realism gets a grip from that. So I think there is a precedent for what you're saying within analytic philosophy.
Thank you. So there is a book of someone called Keith Allen last year, I think, and his name is something like naive realism.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
something like that. So I'm just reading it, and I think it's very interesting. There are some things close to what I'm saying, but one of the things he's saying is the commitment that he's trying to defend from a naive perspective is mind independence.
Right.
But mind independence is somehow against what I'm saying.
Right, yeah.
So there are a few things that I think we are in the same level, but he's obviously in the same framework that I'm trying to drop.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's right. I think the naive realists like Allen and Campbell don't misunderstand their view, because what really motivates their philosophy is, a problem between the subject-object dichotomy.
Right.
But then they end up endorsing this notion of the mind independence of colour. So I think that Dow is the one that doesn't go into that trap. So that's why I'm mentioning it. But yeah, I think that's.
And about color, it's very interesting because the quote of Varela is from a paper about color. It sounds like obviously it's something else, because you end up by saying crazy things like for our orthodox perspective. This is bananas, and this doesn't make any sense. But it was about color, but it's not something that he went deep on the subject. He just wrote some stuff. So important things to say about it. It's how it's a new story of how the eye evolved in order to learn how to see. Not to detect colors, but how to see. And color is very important in that. So for people like Varela, but also for neuroscientists like Maldonado, to see is not different from when we started seeing things when we were babies. They say we learn how to see. From commonsensical point of view, seeing is something that looks so passively, something that we don't do. But from this different point of view, something that you learn, right? And color is so important in this process. So you also have a different story from the orthodox one in explaining how everything happened. It's a difference, a parallel, it's a very interesting one. So I'm basically taking all of the philosophical commitments that are involved in this new theory. As I said, it's a work in progress. And I'm trying to figure how they fixed in the space of options, the metaphysical debate. So relationalism is obviously the best option to do so, but to correctly accommodate these concepts is not that easy. That's what I'm doing. That's my work.
That's the real problem there is actually saying anything like relevant to science or actually drawing on any of that, given that the science just does need to assume these dichotomies in order to like carve up the world and do
Yes.
experiments on this. So.
Well, my research is strongly based on your work, obviously. That's why it was so important for me you were coming. So.
There's a couple of extremely speculative questions. Like the first one is like I was wondering about the so-called traditional different dimensions or aspects involved in color, like hue, brightness, and saturation.
Yes.
And I was wondering if we can give a different ontology for each one, because some of these properties seem to be affected by different phenomena. For example, I'm trying to make a link between your talk and some things I'm going to say later in the evening, but you were talking about color constancy in your example. And in color constancy, things seem to remain the same across different light conditions.
Yes.
Basically. And that doesn't follow, for example, when we think about attention, things seem to change when we are somehow located in different attentional contexts. So one thing is to say that you have color constancy, right, under different light conditions, but perhaps we cannot say that we have a color constancy under different attentional conditions. So when we attend a color, for example, it can get more saturated, or the contrast can actually change. So based on that intuition, I was thinking that perhaps we don't need a sort of homogeneous theory for all three aspects. Some of them can be sort of relational under the traditional framework and other not. So perhaps within the aspects of color, we can sort of make further distinctions. Of course, I'm not talking about your new proposal, but I'm trying to complicate things even more. I mean, so what do you think? Because I mean,
yes.
I'm working on attention. So when you attend something, you have a, for example, within the representational framework, you have like a phenomenological shift.
Right.
And there's a difference. We're still using the same like color words, but nonetheless, there's a change in phenomenology. So how can you explain that there is a sort of a distinction between one type of properties, for example, contrast properties, and other types of properties which might be relevant for the whole framework of a hue of a color, or something like that. And it's just a comment. I mean, I don't have a clue about what the answer would be. And the second one is like, can you say a bit more about the no red dots?
If you like go like that,
Yeah.
you see them without the context and they look grey.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now I understand why you Okay.
So the first thing is about attention. I want to say something about it. I'm not sure that in the case of color constancy, that's a thing really involved. Here's why. I believe that you are seeing red here, not because of an illusion, but because it's an educated guess of your senses. It's not that it's not educated in the sense of your conscience. It's not the debate of conceptualism and not conceptualism in this case. It's an educated guess of your senses based on your history, your biological history. So, given this context, the best guess of your senses is that strawberries are red. But it's not the concept of the strawberry. It's not either the attention on where are the points that you are putting your attention. It's the educated guess of your eye and your brain that tells you, well, it's very ambiguous. What I'm looking? It's probably red. Let's go with red. And then you're watching that. Independently of the concepts that you have and the attention that you put on the picture. It's a different explanation. It's an ecological explanation in a way. I don't know about the differences between hue and
yeah, but my worry is that intuitively, without making a lot of theory, when you talk about color constancy, you might think that there is a sort of common property that characterizes the phenomenology of your color experience, like a common color percent or something like that. But if you have like a radically contextually dependent theory of properties, you are constantly changing properties, even though you might not be able to discriminate between them and use the same concept. So we have like a rival stories about what is going on. Like, okay, we know that there are differences objectively speaking, but at the subjective level, like we have a common property. Magda will call that a highest common color or something like that. And we based our judgments on that phenomenology, which is constituted by that common property. That could be one model, but a different model would be to say like, okay, we use the same concept, but we are not using the same concept because we base that concept on a common phenomenal property. But we have different properties that somehow are opaque or not transparent from the first person point of view, and we use a sort of general concept in order to communicate with each other or something like that. But in the second case, in the extremely relational, or perhaps even in the ecological sense, there are many properties around, like constituting constantly what's going on in your brain or something like that.
Yeah, I believe you'll find theories close to each of the things you are saying in the space of option. Like the primitivist, they're going to say something like that. There's something that everything in the objects share when you're perceiving this or that color, even though it's not reducible to something physical, for instance. So you can go from that to a physicalist. Physicalist in terms of a token type of physicalism or a type physicalism. So there's a lot of these are not theories but families of theories for that. So probably you will find the things you're saying in one of these families. I'm not sure in which now, but yeah.
Yeah, it's probably a variety of what you call like extrinsic disposition.
Ah, right.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
We have two final questions, and we have then go to line.
You speak about this non-local or universal view of, I don't know, experience or
Yes.
yes.
At the end. At the end?
At the end, yes. But I don't know, how do you or this approach address our experiential perspective of being an agent that look the world outside? How you do address that, or how this approach address, or try to explain this
Yes.
everyday experience? You know, that we are a point of we have a point of view about the world.
Yes. So the first thing is, as I said before, I believe that this way of thinking about the world as something outside is a constructed notion. It's not something. I know it seems difficult to understand because I'm going to give you an example. I'm just going to give you an example. When some priests, Christian priests, they went to visit the Dalai Lama, okay, and they wanted to talk about religion, how different were the religions, etc. And the Dalai Lama said very in a naive way, but in a good way. He said, "So you had the theory of God," he said, and the priests were like a little bit shocked about that. It was like theory of God. I mean, the starting point is God. You are the weird one that doesn't believe. The thing is, the notion of external world is like God for this priest. It's like, obviously, we start by, the starting point is by thinking about the world as an external thing. But notice that it's a constructed idea. You can track, actually, who were the thinkers that proposed that idea. The evidence for that is you have entire cultures that don't think that way. Entire cultures. Actually, some philosophical expressions of this you can find in Japan, for instance. They are like, is this representative picture of the world? Are you kidding me? I mean, from where? But for us, it's obviously. I mean, I'm seeing external objects. It's obvious. So that's the first thing. I believe that it's a constructed. So, but now to trying to answer your question, it's a difficult question because, and it's a difficult answer, of course, because how you drop this idea, how you start to perceive or feel the world, the universe differently. I mean, in a personal level, meditation, no other way, but in an intellectual level, started to change the concept that you're using, like subject, okay, no, maybe not subject, maybe a different, maybe not object, maybe not the world, maybe environment, maybe the way we, maybe the way we interact with the environment and the behavior that comes after that explains, it's explained in a better way if you change that framework.
Yes, but the scientists start from the point of view.
Yeah, so that's why color is so important, because from that framework you cannot explain color. You try to explain color from the framework as inside, outside. Actually, that's why so many philosophers and scientists are interested about color, because precisely it shows up that something that is so obvious that it belongs to the external world doesn't belong to the external world in the way we are experiencing it. And it's also not an illusion. You have to change. This is the whole point of my presentation, and I think the whole point of all relationalists. You cannot explain color with that framework. End of the story. You have to change it. But if you can't explain color, then it's like dominoes that boom, 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 boom. Because if you cannot explain color in that sense, there are a lot of things that you cannot explain then. Segmentation of objects, perception from the shape, grouping of objects, perception of content. You will end up, in my opinion, by saying you cannot, at the end of the day, you cannot explain experience in that framework. So we have to, we need a different starting point. And yeah.
So, one final question from me.
Well, it was related to the idea we have to change the framework because it doesn't work, and we need an alternative, and hopefully we need an alternative that is consistent or friendly with scientific practice.
Yes.
So I would think that a very good candidate could be autopoietic theory,
yes,
or that framework.
Right.
The thing is that, so you need that because related to Nicolas' question, you don't have an subject-object relation,
yes, probably
probably for many reasons, but one of them is that you don't have you won't have like an asymmetric relationship, which you will just have two variables related that are part of a single system. But then your new framework has to provide some criteria for determining that two given variables are part of the same system and are not only variables of these different systems that are relating to each other. And the thing is that I have recently read this idea by some very known defenders of autopoietic theory, Mario Villalobos and Pablo Raceto,
that they have the idea that that in autopoietic theory you can have some kind of extended mind or extended life even, but it doesn't include the environment.
Sorry,
It doesn't include. You can use autopoietic theory to claim that there is a system that includes a given organism and its environment. You can only use it to say that you can have an autopoietic system including many organisms, but not the organism and the environment. So if that is so, would you consider an alternative framework, or you will try to see if they are wrong, or for instance, some kind of functionalism which the traditional arguments for extended mind are based on?
So to the first part of your question, I agree. I need that. I need to explain how things works in terms of what's happening when we're proceeding an object. So yeah, the autopoietic levels, we could say. I mean, you can explain life in an autopoietic way, but then you have the environment, and you're saying that we cannot apply the concept of autopoiesis in the relation between an organism and the environment. Okay, so that this is the claim.
They say.
They say.
And they're
the
specialists, so
If that's the case, yeah, I probably, if I think he's right, does he provide a different, like an alternative to it, to autopoiesis?
No, they think that autopoiesis can support extension, but only for a complex system that relates different organisms, but not the organism and the environment.
The good thing about being in the middle of my research is that I can change there. Maybe I will end up defending something completely different. Hopefully not. But yes, I'm open to that. I'm very, very open to that. Yeah, that's interesting. I would like to read that.
Thank you very much.